9,000 years before the Egyptians built the pyramids, Indians who had survived the bitter cold of the Ice Age were hunting the bountiful game and gathering the natural foods of this valley.
The Little Tennessee River Valley was inhabited, as far as we can tell, probably for the last 12,000 years. This was a continuous occupation by the American Indian. And we have sort of a little time capsule there of the changes that occur in the adaptation to a valley as you move, in a sense, from a relatively simple technological stage, hunters and gatherers living in a land of plenty down there, on to very complex chiefdoms as represented by the Dallas phase in the late prehistoric period, say around 1500 A.D.
Of course, along the Little Tennessee River is where we began, and the Cherokee word for it is Bigatadlana'i. Also, our religion, our organized religion, originates from that area.
The Cherokee Nation, at one time, of all the vast land that we owned, I say we, our ancestors, owned western North Carolina, East Tennessee, northern Georgia, northern Alabama, southern Virginia. Of all the land that we occupied at that time, the territory, that valley was chosen for some reason to be the capital of the Cherokee Nation. Many battles were fought over that battle. A lot of Cherokee people, a lot of soldiers died over that particular valley.
According to a U.S. Department of Interior study, the Little Tennessee River Valley, scheduled to become the reservoir behind the Tellico Dam, represents one of the most important resources for the study of American cultural development in the nation. The history of the valley is rich, and the waters of the reservoir could permanently alter this area, where several significant chapters are still being written. Just what have archaeologists learned about the valley? And why do some Cherokees call it the Lake of Tears? I'm John Alexander, and we'll explore those questions when our program continues. This is the story of water and what it's meant to the people who've occupied this valley for the last 13,000 years or so, what it's meant to the Cherokee Indians. Time-wise, a Cherokee infant was immersed in water moments after it was born. It was part of a purification ritual that the Cherokees practiced throughout their lives.
Water is a purification agent in our doctrine, just in everyday life. Everyone goes to water.
In almost every culture, water plays or has played an important role in religious practices. What role, other than life-sustaining, it may have played in those ancient cultures preceding the Cherokees seems lost to the ages.
Now, we can't dig up a belief system, a religion. What we dig up are the material parts of that, what remain. And here in the Southeast, it's not like Egypt. We don't have the preservation of organic materials. We can't dig up sheets of papyrus and the feathers and the basketry and so on. It must have been a very integral part of those cultures.
The first settlers in this valley of plenty had probably been nomadic hunters, tired of following mammoths, mastodons, and straight-horned bison, preferring instead the much smaller game abundant in the valley. They lived by the river toward the end of the Ice Age, 12 or 13,000 years ago, when the valley was colder and more moist than today.
We're told that about 7,000 years ago the valley became much hotter and drier than it is today, and that during the next 3,000 years the natural springs in the river attracted wild game and animals, and that also drew a lot more people.
There was still more than enough natural food to sustain life. The environment was helping emancipate the Indian from the uncertainties of wild food supplies, and this new leisure time produced some new technology.
River cane like this has been used for the past 9,000 years or so to weave traps for small game, or to weave baskets to place the fish catch from the river here.
Before the Romans had established their empire halfway around the world, an exotic culture was developing in the forests of the Little Tennessee River Valley. Somewhere along the way, the Indians of the valley had met a people whose ideas so influenced their own that they began to devote much time and energy to a new interest, creating the area's first monuments, large earthen mounds. The temple mounds actually originated in Mexico centuries before. How the concept became part of the valley people's culture is still debated, but the similarities in art and ceremonies is enough to encourage speculation about a prehistoric northward migration. If a key to that controversy lies buried somewhere in the valley of the Little Tennessee River, it may never be found.
Monies are not available until the archaeological resource is threatened. And that irony always puts the archaeologists in the sort of running ahead of rising waters or pushing bulldozers, and does not afford, as you might expect, the best conditions to conduct archaeological research. We've located approximately 250 to 300 archaeological sites in the valley. Those sites on which we conducted excavations, we have perhaps uncovered as much maybe as 5% on most of those sites. In many cases, though, it is less than 1%.
The mound excavated at Tokwa appeared to be less than 2,000 years old. Dr. Chapman believes it was ceremonial, with a council house topping it. The Indians of that period lived in sturdy mud huts, cultivated maize, squash, pumpkin, and other crops, and as in the past, trapped and hunted small game, with the river continuing to provide an abundance of fish, as well as a means of transportation from one settlement to another. Bison could often be seen grazing along the banks. They were rather plentiful in the valley before the European onslaught, but as the bison moved further west, it proved to be an omen to the Cherokees that their days in the valley were also numbered. This is the main strip through the Qualla boundary. We found as many views on the Tellico project in Cherokee as we would expect to find in any other town. Obviously, not all Cherokees subscribe to traditional ways, and as it is with most cultures, not all members are necessarily interested in preserving their heritage. In quiet contrast to the stereotypical Indian commercialism of the Strip, those hundreds of Cherokees who keep the traditional ways, or at least try to, live here in the Big Cove area, on the edge of the reservation, with the Great Smoky Mountains their backyard. Cherokee history is an oral history, handed down from generation to generation by storytellers who always began with, "This is what the old men told me when I was a child."
And a large fish came to the top, near the canoe. It frightened the little boy, and he fell into the river. And the large fish that came near the canoe swallowed the little boy.
The story these children are being told is comparable to Jonah and the whale. It goes back to the days when giant sturgeon swam in the waters of the Little Tennessee River, and is supposed to have happened near the Cherokee village of Tokwa. Cherokee tradition also preserves an account of how the principal people, as they called themselves, survived a great flood. Many of the Cherokee stories involve animals and are reminiscent of Aesop's Greek fables. Almost all of them have a moral and reflect the basic premise in the Cherokee worldview: harmony with nature.
Harmony with nature is actually our religion, very close to Mother Earth.
Separating the religious from the secular in the matriarchal society of the Cherokees is really quite difficult.
Women have always played an important role in our tribal government. Well, not only in our tribal government, but just in everyday life. For example, we obtain our clan from our mother rather than from the father.
Headmen of the 7 Cherokee clans used to convene with the principal chief and the war chief in the council house. Also allowed access was the woman who had been bestowed with the title Beloved. She was an advisor to the chiefs.
Her role or her duties was to prepare the sacred black drink, and it was a purification drink, out of sin ritual drink. And she would prepare the drink and serve it to the headmen. She also would determine the punishment that was given to members of the Cherokee tribe that had committed crimes.
Cherokees who committed serious crimes could find sanctuary at Chota, sacred city of refuge, not unlike similar cities described in the Old Testament of the Bible. Chota had been capital of the Cherokee Nation, was perhaps the largest of the Cherokee over-hill towns, with a council house that could accommodate 500. John Hare, assistant chief of the United Kituwa Band of Oklahoma Cherokees, recently visited the valley of his roots. Roy Warren of the Chattanooga Relic and Historical Association took him on a tour of the Overhill town sites. In the last century, Kituwa was the name of a secret society of full-blooded Western Cherokees pledged to resist the advances of the white man's civilization. Hare told us the contemporary Kituwa band's simply a corporation.
Our Kituwa band was formed in 1950 for the purpose of having an organization, an entity that the federal government would recognize, and that's who represents the Cherokee people. In other words, they're dealing with a corporation is what it amounts to.
A corporation, says Hare, which wants to preserve the heritage of its people.
I've read history. I knew this was my roots, and immediately my heart went to thumping, just like a drum.
Earlier, the Western Cherokees voted to join the Eastern Band in the fight to prevent the flooding of the valley. As their representative, Hare came to Chota and walked the earth where the old council house had once stood, where the great warrior Oconostota had been laid to rest.
I remember one of our chiefs was buried here. He said, soon I will sleep forever. Please do not desert my bones. And that's the reason I'm here, to follow up on that request.
Oconostota had been the war leader of the Cherokee Nation during the French and Indian Wars. Flanked by Atakalakala, the peace chief from Iloqua, and Ostianaco, who excelled as well in the field of battle as he did around the council fire, Oconostota led the fight to preserve his people's way of life against an ever-swelling horde that was compelled to push further west because they believed it their manifest destiny. At first, the Cherokees got along well with both the French and the English. But as those superpowers pitted tribe against tribe in surrogate battles, the Cherokee were enticed by trade to ally with the British. In the early 1750s, the Cherokees agreed to help the English fight the French further north if they'd build a few forts to protect Cherokee women and families from Creek and Catawba raids. Among these forts was Loudon, where the Tellico River joins the Little Tennessee. Nearby was the Cherokee town of Tuskegee, birthplace of Sequoyah, who years later would form a set of characters to express the sense and sound of the Cherokee language. By 1760, English and Cherokee relations deteriorated, thanks in no small way to the French. Raids and counterattacks marked the brief but devastating war. After the Cherokees learned the peace delegation to Fort Prince George had been murdered, they attacked and burned Fort Loudon. The British struck again, this time hitting towns and villages and crippling the Cherokees for several years. However, that war ended in time for some fence mending prior to the outbreak of the Revolution. But when the Cherokees decided to side with the British, angered colonial rebels led by John Sevier rode into the valley and burned Sitico, Tanasi, Miloqua, Tokwa, and the capital at Chota. The Cherokees were scattered into the mountains. For the Cherokees, the 18th century had been largely one of fighting. Often their villages were left ravaged and the best of their manhood dead. Between wars and disease, there'd hardly been enough time to rebuild huts and repopulate the land. But as the 19th century began, the Cherokees were adopting some of the social and cultural traits of the whites they considered beneficial. The Cherokee Republic evolved. However, gold discoveries in Georgia and North Carolina produced new pressures. It became good politics to push for removal of the Indians. Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett was among the few who fought President Andrew Jackson on the issue, but his stand alongside the Cherokees cost him his congressional seat in the next election. By this time, the Overhill settlements were virtual ghost towns. The capital at the time of removal was New Chota in northern Georgia. Oconostota, Atakalakala, Ostianaco were dead. But exploits of these headmen would be retold time and again on the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees may have been stripped of the land of their ancestors, but they would preserve their memories.
The emotion present day may not be as great as it was during the Trail of Tears, because, you know, the Trail of Tears did cause a lot of death and a lot of heartache and a lot of misery and pain and sickness. This project today won't cause a lot of that, but among our older people here on the reservation today, I think there is a lot of emotional feeling, because I've talked to several of the older people and they indicate that they have memories of Tellico Plains and this area over there.
Those memories were jarred just about a decade ago when archaeologists first began their research on the environmental impact of the Tellico project. Their excavations at Chota unearthed the great warrior, Oconostota. When he died in the spring of 1781, a white friend had quietly laid the old headman to rest in a coffin made from a canoe near where the council house had stood. It was just as Oconostota had requested.
The involvement of the Cherokee have changed during the course of the project. For several seasons, there were Cherokees from the eastern band actively participating in the excavations in the valley, at Chota itself, for example. There has developed a increased awareness, perhaps on their part, and a sensitivity, and we have de-emphasized the Cherokee investigations, actual field investigations, at their request.
The Cherokee people today have respect for our deceased people. Even we have problems today in some of the cemeteries about making them public grounds or what have you.
McCoy points out the ancient Cherokees were buried with their material belongings, probably to prevent hereditary wealth. It made merit the sole means for a Cherokee to acquire power, honor, and riches. The Cherokees have objected to their ancestors being curated in museums rather than being reinterred with respect. And they are also troubled by the desecration of their ancestral home by grave robbers. Poachers are concerned only with whatever relics the ground may yield. And as in this Indian grave, bones are often left exposed and litter left behind.
This land and river meant something to our forefathers, or they wouldn't have fought and died through the numerous battles along this river.
For the Jews, for example, Jerusalem is their holy land. They consider it a holy land. And to us, well, the Tellico Dam area is our holy land. That was the beginning of our organized religion.
Even after the Cherokees were driven from the river valley, they continued to come back here from time to time for religious services. Amanit Sequoyah told us that towards the latter part of the last century, a group came over from North Carolina and were told by a medicine man that a prophecy had revealed to him that the river valley would be flooded in 4 to 5 generations.
The great-great-great-grandson of the man who provided the Cherokees with a written language, Amanit Sequoyah, was trained from childhood by his grandfather to be a medicine man.
He said the Great Spirit gave him a vision, you know, that somebody in the family was going to be a medicine man. And so after he found out who it was, he'd take him out in the woods. He'd go somewhere every day somewhere. And we'd sit down and talk about medicine.
Amanit, who once lived near Chota, says some of the herbs found by the Little Tennessee River cannot be found in Cherokee, so he still makes trips back over the mountain. Although nearly 80 now, Amanit Sequoyah still practices medicine for a score or more of his neighbors in the Big Cove area on the Qualla boundary. He says that he sometimes worries that he has no son interested enough in the old ways for him to pass down his medicine to. But there is a greater worry. Amanit Sequoyah fears if the waters cover Chota and other sacred places of the Cherokees, the medicine that comes from there will be ended, and the strength and spiritual power of his people will be destroyed. He won't be able to go home again.
It's a place you can go and regain the strength of your life.
The Tennessee Valley Authority has told the Cherokees that just as replicas of Fort Loudon and the Tellico Blockhouse are being constructed, so too will they construct a replica of the Council House at Chota. A living Cherokee village, an outdoor drama, and a museum are also being discussed. In a 1978 report on the potential for development of the river or the reservoir, the TVA took the position that the heritage of the Little Tennessee River Valley could be preserved through an interpretation of that history in a Williamsburg-type setting along the banks of the reservoir. However, the Cherokees argue that it's difficult to gain spiritual strength from replicas of their culture on land that means nothing to them when their ancestral homelands have been inundated.
There's so much that began there that we consider it, all of that area, sacred, because that's our beginning. And no doubt it will be our end. Should we lose that, it will be our end, because prophecies tell us that one day the Cherokee would revert back to their Cherokee religion. And today, many people have, gone back to the Cherokee religion, whereas we're close to nature. And our prophecies tell us that this would happen. And when this happens, we will once again be the real people.
The damage is done. I watch the trees fall and the animals run. The tiny snail darter once stood in your way. So you up and moved him and dug in his grave. Farewell to the river. Farewell to the land. Farewell to the river. I'm sorry, but they did not understand. The big politician who rules this free land, he says that it's time now to build a new dam. But I pray to the Father, creator of all, that this big destruction will just up and fall. Farewell to the river. Farewell to the land. Farewell to the river. I'm sorry, but they did not understand. Now they'll try to understand that roll on, little river, roll on, through the land, roll on, little river. Perhaps now they'll try to understand. Perhaps now they'll try to understand.